Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to another edition of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today I have a man who is an illustrator, and I don't know if you write. I guess you write too,
Yes.
but you've you wrote a book at least, and we'll talk
Yes.
about that. So, and
Writer
many
artist.
many other things. You're a fan, everything else, and here he is, Michael T. Gilbert. How are you?
Doing fine.
All
Good to be
right.
here.
Well, thank you very much. So, you reached out to me just because you were interested in my Harvey Comics companion. So, and then I realized, oh, this gentleman's done a lot of stuff. I should probably have him on my podcast. So,
Well,
here,
I was
here,
before that,
here
even
we
to
go.
get the your crack books, I picked up a couple of those too.
Oh, okay. And it's like you've been around forever, it seems like, and you've done a little of everything. So, um, I guess the best thing is tell me how you kind of got your start in the business. It looks like you started like in the underground kind of world first. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started that. I was trying to break into the mainstream comics. I went to DC and talked to a couple of people a couple of times back in 71 or 72 and
Hmm.
got nowhere. Had interviews with James Warren two or three times and back in again 71 or so,
Hmm.
and came close to selling a one pager for their creepy loathsome lord. Didn't quite do it. Um, and sent some stuff to when I was in college. I sent some did some a story or two and sent it to the undergrounds. And there was the printman had a Yellow Dog Comics, and the woman who was editing the thing at that time said she loved the story, loved to use it, but they've discontinued the comics. So I was out of luck again.
Hmm.
Um, but my I was going to State University of New Paltz, upstate New York. Um, this was around 1972, 73. And I was doing cartoons for their school paper, editorial cartoons and things like that, and found out that they were going to be doing a comic book, an underground comic book. And I said, "Well, that sounds great." So I started submitting stories,
Hmm.
which they liked, and they got me to do a cover for it. Um, and then at the end of the year, they didn't do it. They said, "Well, we'll do it next year instead." So,
Hmm.
okay, fine. So I kept waiting for another year. And at the end of the year, they were about to publish it again. Everything's ready. They have photostats, they have negatives. They spent the rest of their budget on a fireworks display at the end of the year. And so that was that. So I was really pissed.
Yeah,
I
I
knocked
would
my
be.
brains out on this here. So I went there and I took the negatives and I took it back with me. And I never had any idea of doing publishing, but I said, okay, let's see what this costs to do this. And it was actually something I could afford. I think it was like $600. And I had a student loan, and I used that to publish it, and was selling it door to door at the campus, and it was New Paltz Comics #1. So that was
Oh, okay.
1973, which means this is my 50th anniversary of me getting in print in my comic stories.
Hmm. So when did those other kind of titles like Slow Death and Bizarre Sex and everything like that come about?
Shortly after, what happened was I graduated from school with an art education degree,
Hmm.
which I never planned to use, at the end of 1973, and moved to New York, stayed at my grandmother's house for a couple of months. And again, tried to break into DC, and Marvel wouldn't even tell me where they were located. They just moved. So um, it
We're, mo-
makes you feel wanted. Um,
we're moving to avoid him.
right. Um, and I was running out of money, but I was looking
Mhm,
for any kind of art shop that I could get,
mhm,
and I found something, actually a pretty good one. It was at NBC.
hmm,
They had the NBC News in New York had a graphics department, a place called Bismo right across the street. And I just came in cold. I just happened to walk past there, knocked on there, and they gave me a part-time job and doing graphics for the news, which I did for some months.
hmm,
Then they got rid of the people after a few months for some reason. The NBC wanted to start their own in-house art department instead of farming it out. Um, so I got a job doing a place called Hit Sales, doing keychains, art jobs like that. And it went fine. It was fine for about a year,
Mm-hmm.
and then I got kind of tired of it. It's like this isn't not going to be fun. And one of my friends there had said that he was going to be moving to California.
Hmm.
And again, it had never occurred to me to move to do anything like that. And I said, why not? Just because I have no money, I'm young,
Yeah.
this and
Yeah.
that here. So I moved to California on some old gray bus that some with a wood stove inside, and you sleep on the floor, and they go there. And
Mm-hmm.
my roommates at the time said, before that said, are you going to Los Angeles? Or are you going to San Francisco?
Hmm.
And I didn't even know the difference at that time. It's like, I'll have to say where it's going here. So, it turns out to be in the San Francisco area. Luckily for me, because I think that's more my speed.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was that I would go down there and see if I could break into underground comics,
Mm-hmm.
which was a great idea, except this was in 1975, and the whole underground comics thing had just collapsed at that
Yeah, I
point.
was gonna say
Yeah, so it's like,
kind of the tail end,
okay.
kind of the tail end of it, but yeah.
Yeah, but eventually I managed to get a few jobs here and there. Slow Death, Bizarre Sex,
Mm-hmm.
eventually American Splendor a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
So I started getting my foot in the door and started getting things
Yeah.
going.
Then you kind of got into the second wave. I consider it. It's like the first wave would be the undergrounds that are just trying to be scandalous and maybe dirty and whatever. Whereas
Hmm.
the later ones, mid 70s on, especially into the 80s, tried to just be like more serious or straightforward or something, and those are the ones you tended to do, like Star Reach and Quack and things like that seem to kind of fall in that latter category more than the former.
Yeah, they weren't really underground comics per se. They were more mainstream comics with little tits and ass,
Yeah, they
in
call them
some of the stories anyway.
independent, I guess, later
Right,
on.
independence. Um, but yeah, that was my big break, because I had gone down to see Mike Friedrich, who was the publisher of Star Reach Publications. He was also a comic book writer of renown. And I had shown him some of my science fiction stuff. I was trying to get into his Star Reach science fiction fantasy book.
Right.
And there was nothing there that he kind of liked it, but nothing that he felt like buying.
Mm-hmm.
But then a week or so later, I got a call from him saying that they're starting out this new comic book called Quack, a funny animal comic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the contributors had flaked out at the last minute, and they had a big hole in there.
Mm-hmm.
Their bad fortune was my good fortune. And I think he said, have you ever done funny animals before? And I said, yeah, I'm great at that kind of stuff, which I had never done a funny animal comic in my life. But yeah, fake it till you make it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I went home, and I came up over a weekend with a character that I thought I could use, a funny animal version of the spirit, Will Eisner's spirit, called the Wraith.
Mm.
And that gave me a starting point that I could work with.
Right.
And I went from there.
Mm-hmm. Now, growing up, I'll kind of backtrack a little bit. So,
Mhm.
were you? They always say the Wraith is kind of inspired by the spirit, Will Eisner's
Right.
spirit, and that's
Mhm.
correct. Okay. But even if you didn't do it before, were you inspired by, say, the Donald Duck stories, or even the Harvey stories, or Little
Mhm.
Lulu, or anything else while growing up, even if your style didn't necessarily fit into that initially, or did
Yeah.
it?
Well,
I know that's a convoluted question, but
yeah. Well, I was a comic book maniac from the age of 6 or 7, when my grandmother gave me my first comic.
hmm
And I would read anything. And the Walt Disney comics and stories were super popular back in
hmm
the 50s. This is the 56, 57, 58. So my grandmother worked at a hospital, Montefiore Hospital, in the Bronx, and in the children's ward they had comic books, and so she would take them, and give them to me. Um, So since those were so popular, I wound up getting a lot of Walt Disney comics and stories and Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and this and that here. My real passion was the superheroes, this Batman and Superman, the Marvel Monster comics and this and that here. But I really did like the Disney comics.
Mhm.
I was remembering that one of the early comics that I did request from my grandmother. Picked there. I had a copy of Casper Comics, and they had advertised the first issue of Hot Stuff.
Mm.
Well, that was as close as horror as I could get. This was after the Comics Code had come in,
Right.
and they probably got rid of any comics that were older, that had Tales from the Crypt. Anything was really brutal, they tossed it out before they even showed it to the kids. So I never got any of that stuff. But she brought me back the copy of Hot Stuff, and I thought it was really cool looking, with all of the flames and all this other stuff.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, this stuff is, I absorbed all that stuff.
Hmm.
Um, it,
Now, how did you
it,
see the Spirit, if that was the inspiration for the Wraith? I mean, was that
mhm.
being published at that time? I thought it was only a newspaper insert, or maybe my history is
Yeah,
escaping me on
no,
that.
it was a newspaper comic book in a
Okay.
newspaper,
Okay. So you
either
did see that
8 pages
okay.
or 16 pages, but I didn't see those. This
Oh,
is before my time.
okay.
That was from about 1940 to 1952, and I
Hmm.
was born in 1951. So, it was the late 50s were when I started reading comics. Um, but there was a comic company called IW Comics, and they did unauthorized, often reprints of
Oh,
Golden Age comics.
yeah.
And I got my hands on a couple of reprints of police comics with Plastic Man and the Spirit, and I
Okay.
fell in love with that stuff.
I see.
Uh,
Okay.
so that was my first introduction to
Yeah.
that.
See, I'm a little bit younger, so my introduction to the Spirit is Warren magazines were publishing him in the early '70s. So,
Yeah, those are
and
terrific. I was thrilled to get those.
already Kitchen Sink had them, and Harvey had them for a couple issues and things like
Hmm.
that. So, I mean, and it was on the cover of the Price Guide in the mid '70s. So, I was
Hmm.
aware of it that way. But there's a long time I know it kind of was you had to kind of be in the know or something because it wasn't being published anywhere, or if you just happen to have back issues or something like that.
Yeah, I
So
mean, the first really large taste of Will Eisner stuff was when the Harvey Spirits came out in 1965, 66.
hmm.
They were double size issues reprinting some of the best spirit stories from the 1940s and 50s.
Hmm.
And it was just astounding stuff. And I've talked to lots of um, creators that saw those issues and were just knocked out and inspired, and were showing what you could do with comic books. It didn't have to be a kid's medium. It could be well written, well drawn, the storytelling, and you could tell it in 7 pages. You had 7 page stories, and it was just beginning, middle, and end characterization, full page splash. Um, that would pull you right into it as like a poster for the story.
Hmm.
So that was what I was trying to do when I was started doing the Wraith.
Hmm.
I wasn't trying to just straight out copy
Hmm.
Eisner, but get the spirit of the spirit, which is to say,
Hmm.
I was trying to write different types of stories each issue with the character. It'd be a slapstick one issue, next it would be a love story, and
Right.
which is what Eisner was doing back in the 40s. It
Hmm.
was just amazing stuff.
And were you trying to emulate his Eisner's layouts and things like that? Because
Yeah, I was definitely trying to
ultra
do that.
creative with how he laid out, like even the letters of the Spirit. Sometimes they would go, vertically. Sometimes, they'd be
Right.
like hanging laundry or something. It's something different than just the Spirit.
Oh yeah, well, I would absolutely do that. That's one of my favorite things of Eisner. So I incorporated a full page splash with each of my stories,
Hmm.
incorporating the lettering inside the stuff. Even did my own lettering throughout those stories.
Hmm.
Um, not necessarily the greatest letterer, but at least it was expressive, which what I was shooting for.
Now, did Eisner ever see your work, and did he ever comment on it?
Yes. When I finished, the series got canceled after 6 issues,
Hmm.
and then I started doing some work for Mike Friedrich's science fiction magazine, Imagine, and Star Reach.
Hmm.
Um, but after the 6 issues finished, I said, well, all 6 issues,
Mm.
sending him and saying, I wasn't trying to rip you off, Will, but I was just really inspired by this. I hope you like it. And he wrote me a very nice letter back saying he liked it, and he drew a little spirits and story. And by an interesting coincidence, he was working on his first new graphic album, A Contract with God. And he was
Mm.
just doing, I hadn't heard anything about it, but I just heard he was doing this. As it turned out, I was doing a story about Jews in space for Imagine Comics, A
Mm.
Dream of Milk and Honey.
Mm.
So I sent him some copies of that, and he was very enthusiastic because it was the same sort of material. So we sort of came at the same place at the same time. So it
Mhm.
was, yeah, I guess I absorbed enough of Will Eisner to have some of that too.
Did you remain friends or just casual
Yeah,
acquaintance? Okay.
yeah, I know we had a correspondence, and then eventually he had moved to one time when he was in teaching the School of Visual Arts. Um, I had moved away. I was in California, and I
Mhm.
came and visited, and he asked me to speak to his class, and I spoke to his
Mm.
class.
Cool.
Very nice. And again, we kept corresponding, and I visited his when he moved to Florida, Tamarack, Florida. I visited him 2 or 3 times with my wife, and again, very nice guy and
Yeah.
very enthusiastic. And
Mhm.
I got to see the graphic novel he was working on at
Oh,
various
cool. Yeah.
times, so
Yeah.
that was kind of a thrill.
And the only time I ever saw him was him roaming around uh, San Diego Comic Convention, and
Mhm.
usually he was pretty busy running off to something, so you really couldn't talk to him too much. But you
Well,
know,
I've
uh,
seen him
yeah,
at some
yeah,
somewhat smaller conventions, and I was
yeah,
really impressed that he would, take the time to actually get away from his table, go and talk to different newcomers and creators, and comment on their work, and
yeah.
just chat with them. Just really nice guy.
Yeah, I've heard that before, that he was doing that, which is kind of how he got affiliated with Dennis Kitchen and stuff like that, which you would think that that would be an odd alliance, but they're
Hmm.
what I've heard very similar in how, they're entrepreneurial and they try to do things their own way. So,
Hmm.
so it kind of worked out. Um, let's see, another person you worked with, and you mentioned the series already, American Splendor, with Harvey
Hmm.
Pekar. How
Right.
did that come about? So just kind of curious.
Well, I was a big fan of underground comics in general. Had a pretty large
Mm.
collection,
Mhm.
such and such. And when he came out with about 1976, 75 or 76, I forget, with the
Mhm.
first issue of American Splendor, I thought it was a really neat comic.
Mhm.
And at some point, so I think with the fourth issue, third, fourth issue, I wrote him a sort of a fan letter, and I said, and I kind of I liked what you were doing here, but there was a one-page story that I thought the artwork really got just missed out with what you were trying to do.
Mhm.
So he said, "Why don't you do the one pagers?" Which I did, and
Mhm.
he liked it. And
Cool.
um, in one of the next issues, there was supposed to be some stories that Bob Crumb was supposed to illustrate. Well, he flaked out,
Oh,
and so they thought that my style might be able to fake it. So I did a few stories like that.
very cool. Yeah, I was always wondering how. I mean, I know him and Crumb were good friends, but how it branched off from there. I guess it's just how you say, write him a letter saying, "Hey, I like your stuff," and suddenly you're
Yeah,
working on it. I guess
sometimes
because
that works. I mean,
yeah,
just genuinely writing. I just want, I wasn't really looking for work. I just wanted to say, I like what you're doing here.
right. So, you've worked on a lot of different things. Now, at this point, um, were you still exclusively doing independent stuff or underground stuff, or were you already getting into like DC and stuff like that?
No, I was at this stage of the game. I was still working in independent comics, not for lack of trying to.
Right.
If DC had come to me and said, "We'd like you to do a project," I would have said sure, but
Hmm.
that wasn't the case.
Hmm.
I was in California; they were in New York, and it
Hmm.
was, there wasn't much overlap there
Hmm.
in general.
So, was your
Um,
next big project an Elric, or am I jumping things around?
yeah, that's pretty much the next thing here.
Okay. Okay.
So I was working for Star Reach, like I say, on Imagine,
Hmm.
and Star Reach, and Star Reach went under. Mike overextended himself, and this
I
and
think I
that here. So
remember
he
that.
became he reinvented himself. First, he started working for Marvel, selling, in their um, uh, showing them how to sell comics and this and behind the scenes, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But then he started becoming an agent for comic book writers and artists and creators.
Hmm.
And at some point, Pacific Comics was just starting, what became one of the bigger alternative publishers
Right.
from San Diego, I believe. And they decided they wanted to do an Elric comic book.
Hmm.
Craig had done a Marvel version. Craig Russell had done an Elric graphic novel for Marvel, and they decided, let's see if we can get him to do a series, an Elric series for us. Well, Craig was interested, but he felt it would just be too time consuming to do by himself.
Hmm.
And he said, well, maybe I can work with somebody else. And Mike suggested, how about Mike Gilbert?
Hmm.
And as it had turned out, I had done one of the little projects I had done. Dennis Kitchen had published a jam issue of The Spirit with about 50 different creators.
Yeah.
So I did a 3-page sequence with The Spirit, and it was very detailed and really polished. I spent a lot of time on this. Well, Craig saw that and thought, this might work. It looked good.
Hmm.
The only thing was, he wanted to work with me there, so I would have to move to Ohio.
Hmm.
I was living in Texas at that point
Oh, okay.
with my first wife, and the marriage broke up, and suddenly, unexpectedly on my part, and I got this offer to go down to Ohio, and I said, "Hey, what a great way to reinvent myself! Just get away from all this stuff.
Hmm.
This would be my big break. I'd never done a color comic book before. This was, the big time as far as I was concerned. And so I, put everything in you know, stored some things and moved down there and
Hmm.
started working with Craig on Elric. And
Wow.
it was very intimidating because, we know how brilliant Craig Russell is. His stuff is fantastic.
Hmm.
My advantage has been that I have a bit of humor, which I think added to this series. And I have great many styles that I work at. I can do funny animal comics. I can do, it turns out, superhero comics and sword and sorcery.
Hmm.
Um, so I was able to sort of merge my style with Craig's.
Hmm. So ultimately, how long, how many years and how many issues did you do together?
Craig and I did about 6 issues over 2 years.
Okay.
Very labor intensive stuff. We were doing the coloring and all that material. And it was full color at a time that there wasn't very much full color comics out there. So we were really just experimenting, trying to make this work.
Hmm.
I mean, I told the story before, but there was we got these things called gray lines for the coloring. After we finished it, they would photograph it, do it at comic book size. They would be the black line would be on clear acetate, and there would be a light gray version of it that you would use as a color guide. You color it, and this and that. Well, middle of the winter, starting to do this, and somehow they didn't size it properly, so it wasn't holding the colors. It would blob up,
Oh.
and the deadline is coming up in a couple of weeks, or a few weeks.
Mhm.
And we're just thinking, what are we doing? And we had this terrible diner called Jerry's Diner in Kent, Ohio. And sitting there about at night and freezing cold, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? This is going to just blow up in my face. Unfortunately, I was able to figure out that this might not work, but as a temporary thing, I was able to get them reduced Xeroxes on some cardboard stock,
Hmm.
and we colored that for the first couple of issues. later on we went back and did it the proper way, and they finally, get some of the bugs out. But I assume that we're working with Pacific Comics. They must know what they're doing. There's Craig Russell, this and that. Nobody knew. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll have to fake this one. I guess we're pioneers. So okay, we'll do that.
Mm. Wow. And did that series just basically end because Pacific Comics kind of ended, or
No. We adapted the first Michael Moorcock graphic
okay.
novel into.
Oh,
It was planned to be a 6-issue
oh, I
series,
see. Okay. Okay.
and then Craig had other things. He didn't want to continue. There was going to be a second book
Mhm,
adapting the second Elric book,
mhm,
and by this time, Pacific Comics had gone, and First Comics had taken over. First,
mhm.
I keep working with these companies that go collapsing, but
Right. And
Pacific went under, and First Comics came, and they took over the title, and they asked me if I wanted to stay on. And in the first one, Craig had been doing the layouts and such. Well, by the second time, I was doing the layouts and going to the book and deciding how we're going to tell this visually.
mhm,
And they suggested working with George Freeman,
mhm.
whose work I loved, and I thought that was great. So eventually, we did 6, 7 issues of adapting that, and it looked very nice. And then they asked me to do a third one. I did a third one with George again.
Mhm.
So I wound up doing 3 different graphic novel
Okay.
adaptations.
Now that makes more sense. See, originally when I asked him, you said we did 6 issues. I was saying surely there is more, but I didn't realize it was all adaptations of the novels. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
So okay,
Well, it's
because
kind of nice to have a finite thing like that instead of just continuing. Any Marvel or DC comic,
you know, or,
these things
or
they just
some
go on forever. This continual soap opera that never
or
ends.
or some mega thing like Cerebus the Aardvark or something.
Right.
300 issues. Like,
Oh man.
So what I have different things listed with the next thing that you did, or be working at DC or Disney or what, or is it just a little bit of everything all at the
Well,
same
the next thing
time?
was working on Mr. Monster.
Oh, I'm skipping that, of course. Yeah,
Yes.
just your most famous thing. Oops.
Right.
All right, go
Well,
ahead.
Mr. Monster turned out to be was my signature character over the
Oh,
years. I've
yes.
been doing off and on for 40 years basically,
Hmm.
different miniseries and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, what had happened is that Pacific Comics had been doing this anthology title called Vanguard Illustrated,
Hmm.
and they would team up a new artist or writer with an established writer or artist, and they work on stories together. It was an anthology title. Anyway, Craig and I had finished the first Elric graphic novel, and we hadn't started with George yet. And I had
Hmm.
a couple of months in between, and my agent wanted to keep me busy, so he said, "Would you like to come up with a character that would appear in Vanguard Illustrated?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Yeah." So I was trying to decide what to do, what kind of character. There's one of these things where you had to come up with it pretty quickly.
Hmm.
And once again, I came to my comic collection for inspiration.
Hmm.
And years earlier, back in about 1971 or so, I had been at New York Comic Convention
Hmm.
and found this coverless comic with this character, Mr. Monster. It was a Canadian comic, as I later found out.
Yeah.
And I thought just the coolest character. He was just this monster fighting superhero, just really just, single-minded. I just hate monsters. And I was thinking, that's something I haven't seen around. There wasn't too much mixing of superheroes and horror. Nowadays you see Hellboy and a million other things like that.
Right. Hmm.
Back then maybe the Spectre, but that was or Dead Man, but there wasn't too much of that sort of thing. And I said, what if I updated, reinvented this character, this Mr. Monster, and for the 80s, 1986, 83 is when I started working on it.
Hmm.
And I pitched it, and they liked it. There was another cartoonist, Bill Loebs, who had a very Will Eisner style, and I thought this would be a great way to get the kind of feel that I wanted.
Hmm.
And so the plan was that I would do scripting and rough pencils
Hmm.
and colors,
Hmm.
and Bill would do the finished pencils and inks.
Hmm.
And we started doing that. It was going to be 3 issues in Vanguard Illustrated 7, 8, and 9.
Hmm.
Well, true to form, we came out with issue 7 with the chapter 1 of my story, our story,
Hmm.
and Pacific collapsed. Pacific died once again. So great. So we had 3 issues. The whole story finished.
Yeah.
Um, and I found out about this. I, I had started dating the person who was now my wife, Janet.
Hmm.
Janet Clark back then, Janet Gilbert now,
Hmm.
and we were going to be going to tired of the freezing cold winters in Ohio. Let's go to uh, California again, this and that. So we're on our way, or just about to go on our way, when I found out that Pacific Comics had collapsed. It's this. No, this is wonderful. Let's see if I don't have a job now, but let's continue going there.
Hmm.
But Mike Friedrich, luckily, had gone, and it was able to place Mr. to convince them that the Eclipse Comics, a new company,
Hmm.
how about trying a 1 issue Mr. Monster comic? Taking all 3 chapters, um, and they did, and it seemed popular, and they said, "Let's do a continuing series," and we went from there.
Hmm. Seems like Eclipse rescued a lot of Pacific's things, like Sergio Aragonés Gru, and I think they did the final issues of Twisted Tales and things like that. That were
Yeah,
already
they were doing
great.
a lot of that
Yeah,
stuff about
yeah. So yeah,
alien
hooray for
worlds.
Eclipse. Yeah. Now, where were they based out? I don't remember.
Guerneville, California.
Oh, okay, okay.
Mhm.
And so backing up a little bit on the creation of Mr. Monster, you revealed something I didn't know, because it
Mhm.
just says, "Oh, you based it on this character that Fred Kelly did," but it didn't
Mhm.
say how you came about, because earlier in our discussion you were saying, well, I didn't have access to old issues when you were younger, and then later I guess you became more of a collector. So how did you happen upon this particular coverless comic? And
Well, I've always been a collector, but then I started. I went to my first comic book convention
hmm.
in 1968. One of the New York, they call them Suling cons. Phil
Right,
Suling
right,
was
right.
putting them on, um, and I was just thrilled to be. It was so hard to find golden age comics. I found some beforehand, so by trading with some comic fans who had a few golden age things. So I got I started getting some golden age, but
Hmm.
and a couple of EC comics and this and that here. But when I finally went to the Suling Con, I got to see the rooms filled with these old comic books, and of
Hmm.
course. I had very little money, so I would go for the ones that had bad conditions or coverless, or quantity over quality. But I was always trying to get the more that I could read and really study these
Hmm.
things here.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, the first comic convention I was at, that 1968 Suling Con,
Hmm.
saw this new kid out there. One of the lectures that people had gone, and there was a panel, and he was just sitting here. He was showing his stuff here,
Hmm.
and the few of us were getting around looking at this stuff. It was Bernie Wrightson, and he
Oh,
was just a
wow.
kid, and he was
Yeah.
just showing his stuff. He had this thing called Uncle Bill's Barrel,
Hmm.
and it was just phenomenal. We just knew that this guy, and this was the convention where he met DC and started his career and mainstream career.
Wow. Hmm.
Um, so in one of those conventions, that was the 68, but 1971, I had gone to the conventions looking around.
Hmm.
And right at the end of the convention, we went to um, some area there. They had this big wooden bin filled with mostly coverless comics from the golden age, a few Supermans from 1948, and they were going for like 50 cents or $1 each. and I saw, a couple of issues of this coverless thing with Mr. Monster,
Hmm.
and I said, this is kind of interesting, So I plunked down a couple of bucks, got them both, um, and some other titles and such. And every so often I take them out and I say, someone should really revive this guy. He's
Right.
really good, but I forgot about it
Hmm.
until I was looking through my comic collection in Kent, Ohio,
Hmm.
and I said, wow, why not?
Now, I haven't seen the original. Is your version of Mr. Monster exactly like Fred's was, or you just kind of were inspired, just kind of more like the Wraith and Spirit thing?
It's similar.
Okay.
He's Fred Kelly's Mr. Monster was slender. I wanted him really bulked up, like a big wrestler, sort of thing here.
Yeah.
Um, um, I have two M's on his insignia. He just had a squiggle, and there
Mm.
was one holster. I put two holsters. I changed his costume a little bit, and this and that. I changed the. He was Doc Stern, Stearne, and I made him Doc Stern, Stearn. Again, so I could copyright these things, and just in case anything showed up, this and that here.
Hmm.
So, but you can inspire later on. I revealed, though I hadn't had at the time, that that was his father. Sort of integrated the two.
Okay.
Uh,
Now, another thing you found out later on is that Fred Kelly was still alive, and you hadn't known that. I mean, how did that make you feel, or were you happy and you tried to reach out to him? I guess.
yeah, I mean, I was, no one had heard from Fred Kelly. He got out of comics. That one of the last things he did was that little 7-8 page Mr. Monster story in
Hmm.
this comic called Super Duper Comics, which I later found out was what it was. Again, it didn't have a cover, so I didn't know for a long time. Um, and and someone did some digging. Someone I was corresponding with, and they found Fred Kelly, and I was thrilled that they had discovered him. For one thing, I wanted to give him some money because I've been using his idea, even though he didn't. It was work for hire. He didn't have any rights to it per se. For the company, his company Bell Publishing went under right about the same time. That's why he got out of comics.
Hmm.
Nobody knew what happened to him. We figured he's probably been dead for years.
Right.
Um, Turns out he had gotten into medical illustration for a few years, and then got into real estate and was very successful with
Hmm.
that.
That's good.
Um, but the person who found out was putting out connected with the Toronto Comic Convention, and they invited him to be there with a number of other Canadian Golden Age cartoonists.
Hmm.
And they asked me if I wanted to be on a panel with him.
Wow.
Um, Now, ordinarily, it would have been too expensive for me to go down there. It's just, was one of my, you have high points and low times when you're selling, and sometimes you're just not. And that was
Right.
one of the low times.
Hmm.
Um, and we were living in Oregon at that time.
You've
So,
jumped all over the place. Wow.
oh yeah, I was in Texas also. So yeah, I've been, for someone who doesn't like to move, I should end up moving a lot.
Hmm.
But as it happened, we were visiting my wife Janet's parents in Ohio, in Ravenna, Ohio, um, and just about the same time that the comic convention, by sheer coincidence, was going on,
Hmm.
and it was like a 3 or 4 hour drive. So we were able to go there,
Hmm.
see him. I met him. I was able to give him a check. We were on a panel together.
Hmm.
Before I went there, I sent him a box with a collection of all the Mr. Monster stuff I had done.
Hmm.
And I was hoping that he wouldn't be offended or this or that here.
What did you do to my character? No, I don't know.
Well, the one of the things I found funny, the character started out as a Doc Savage knockoff called Doc Stern, and he
Hmm.
was like Doc Savage. Well,
Hmm.
right at the end, they were desperate to see if they could, salvage this company that was going under. So he had Doc Stern as Mr. Monster, and he puts on a costume and he's fighting monsters, blah, 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 blah.
Hmm.
And then the company went under.
Hmm.
And I had breakfast, with him and his wife.
Mhm.
My wife and I had breakfast, and it was nice thing there. And I said, "Do you, what do you go? Can you tell me about, coming up with Mr. Monster?" He didn't remember he even did Mr. Monster. It was one little 7-page story that he did, 50, 60, 50 years early, 60 years earlier. He probably spent about a week working on that story, or part of a week. No,
Mhm.
no reason to particularly remember that thing, especially
Mhm.
since he got out of the field shortly after.
Mhm.
So I thought it's just kind of astonished me. What a great character, and but he didn't have a chance to develop it because the company went under before he had a chance to.
Yeah. Did his character have any sort of personality or traits or anything, or did you kind of develop that
Oh,
together?
most of that stuff was my stuff.
Yeah, because I figured,
Um,
most golden age stuff are pretty straightforward. They're not too much in
no,
depth
there's no.
characterizations
Well,
on
the
him.
big difference between the two of us is that his had no humor. I mean, it was just straight ahead, dead on. I'm gonna kill
Yeah, yeah, that's
monsters,
what I figured.
which I took, for my Mister Monster, but made the circumstances around him bring out the humor by contrast. The fact that he didn't, he was so determined, become pretty funny,
Hmm.
and you know,
And
it worked.
I assume that Fred's version didn't have any sort of elaborate origin or anything like that that
No,
you
no, he
fleshed
just,
out
just
yourself. Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I, yeah. But one thing that was kind of interesting, I came up with Mr. Monster's Gal Friday.
Hmm.
Was his Kelly Friday. One of these 1940s hotties.
Hmm.
Um, but I came up with a name because she's Kelly, Fred Kelly.
Hmm.
So it's sort of a tribute to Fred, even though years before I knew he was still alive or anything.
Yeah. Then, didn't he pass away shortly after that one convention
Yeah, this
appearance or
is
something like that?
2004, and about a year later, he passed away.
Wow.
Old and not in great. He had had a stroke before I met him, so he was kind of frail.
Mm.
But he also had this sort of determined look. You could just see this. This is the guy that drew the Golden Age Mister Monster. It's just you could see that he was no nonsense in his day.
Hmm. So generally, he was happy with what you did.
Yeah, he seemed fine.
That's cool. Yeah, that would suck
Hmm.
if he would be like, ah, I
Well,
hate
and I was
this.
able to give him
Yeah,
a check, which was
yeah.
nice
Well, I'm
too.
sure that
So
made him very happy.
yes.
Yeah. So anyway,
Mhm.
um, so at that point, if how long? It seems like Mr. Monster ran pretty successfully for a period of time, but I thought you brought him back like 2 or 3 times, if I remember correctly.
A number of
Uh,
times, the
yeah,
different companies I would work for, they go
yeah,
under, and
yeah.
I would
I
do
mean,
mini
I
series.
kind of equate it with like Guru the Wanderer again because he had a long run at Marvel and then on
Hmm.
the Epic line, and then now he's been on Dark Horse in his little mini series every so often, things like that. So,
Hmm.
um, all told, how many issues have you done? Do you think?
Well, I'd say I did about I'd say close to 1,000 pages of work.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
however you want to
Hmm.
divide that.
And is there any plans to do any further Mr. Monster adventures, or you kind of retired that character?
No, no, I've been doing some new Mister Monster stories on my own right now.
Hmm.
But right now, I've been trying to put together a Mister Monster library, which
Hmm.
is to say, collecting all the Mister Monsters from all these various companies all over the
Right, right.
place, those
Yeah.
oddball things.
Hmm.
Um, and in some instances, I've been going in here. Some things were done most of the stuff was in color. I've had some stories where I worked for companies that could only do black and white. Well, I went back and now I've been coloring them in
Hmm.
computer coloring and such, getting some really sharp looking stuff. So it's kind of exciting to me to revisit this stuff.
Hmm.
And the thing that I find kind of amusing in 2023 is going over the old material, which I think still holds up as far as writing and artwork goes.
Hmm.
But the technical aspects of the thing are so different. When I started out, we did these gray tones,
Oh yeah.
these gray lines that I was talking about, and blue lines, and something else.
Hmm.
Um, well, I had to go back there and try and we had negatives, made. And in a lot of cases, I had saved the negatives for these things. Well,
Hmm.
negatives are useless now. You don't use it. Um, but I still had the color. In a lot of cases, I had the color guides that I had, so I was able to scan them and do
Okay.
like that. And
Do you
you know,
still have the original art, or is that long gone? Or
I have a lot of the original art, at least
okay.
at least some of the original art.
Okay.
But I made Xeroxes of
Mhm.
everything. Um, but I am thrilled that I taught myself how to use Photoshop.
Yeah.
I can do things with that I just could not have done, as far as cleaning up negatives and trying different color schemes if it seemed appropriate. You know,
Mhm.
just just nice to be able to sharpen all this stuff up and blacken the blacks and do all sorts of stuff like that.
Right. Mhm. Yeah. When I started off, in my own publishing world in high school, this is in the 80s.
Hmm.
Yeah, we are still doing everything by hand. So I was on the tail end of all that stuff. So I learned how to use Zipatone and, little lines and everything that you had to
Hmm.
cut with X-Acto knives and everything. And it's like all that stuff's kind of useless now, but it's like I know the techniques, but
Right.
it's handy in talking to somebody like yourself who actually did it,
Right.
so I know exactly what you're talking about when you're saying
Well, some of these
great.
things are
Yeah.
just really really kind of fascinating when you look at it. I did a cover for Imagine, and it was my dream of milk and honey, Jews in space story sort of thing here. But anyway, I was doing the cover, which I think was one of my first covers
Hmm.
for them. But it was full color, but I had done it in four different um, pieces of artwork: the red, the black, the blue, the yellow, and they'd be pulled together. Well, I did it with airbrush, and I was doing other things, and they couldn't afford to do a test print,
Mm.
so I didn't know if it was going to work out or not. They put it all together, with these transparencies and whatnot. Unfortunately, it largely did
Oh, that's
work
good.
together, but it's nerve wracking when you're working there.
Yeah.
Nowadays, of course, you just put it on there, click, 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 click. There's the colors.
Yeah.
Boom, you're
Doesn't work.
set.
Click, 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 fix.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I was thinking about
Yeah.
even with Elric. One of the things I was telling you about, where we were working with the gray tones, the gray
Hmm.
lines
Hmm.
early on, and they weren't holding the colors. I came up with an idea of using airbrush, putting it on a frisket paper, clear, and cutting out the colors so they would stick down there, that kind of stuff. But it was
Hmm.
so labor intensive, and if you screwed up, it became a big deal to fix it. Nowadays, if you do something with a color and you don't like the color, you just and let's try blue, let's try green, let's try this,
Hmm.
and it's great.
Hmm. So at this point in your career, I guess you were doing Mr. Monster at the same time you did all this other stuff, like you did Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and Simpsons and
Mhm.
Superman and Batman. That was all kind of at the same time, right? It
Yeah.
seemed like,
Mhm.
because it seems like I've always seen your name pop up in different things over the years, but I didn't know if it was necessarily the same guy. But you're very versatile, so it's like
Well,
looking back
yeah,
on it, I go,
that's one thing I'm proud
that's the
of.
same
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm really proud of is the fact that I have been so versatile. The idea that, in 1989, I started writing and laying out Disney stories first for Disney Adventures.
Hmm.
My wife, Janet, has been doing stuff for that also for many years. Um, but I was able to, and then I was contacted when Disney decided they were going to do their own comic books, their own comic book line for the first time.
Okay.
Um, I was contacted by the editor, David Seidman, who asked me if I'd be interested in working on either Mickey Mouse or Roger Rabbit.
Hmm.
They were having a series, but he based it on the fact that he had seen my Wraith comics, my
Yep.
funny animal Wraith comic. That was my first comic. So suddenly I'm doing the figurehead. I said, okay, let's do Mickey Mouse.
Hmm.
And so I was really the first person to do Mickey Mouse directly for Disney, as opposed to Dell Comics and Gold Key or whatever.
Hmm. So
Um,
you never worked, excuse me, you never worked for Gemstone or Gladstone or anything like that. This
Not
was,
directly, but they some of those people reprinted some of the
I
stories.
see. Okay. All right.
So it did appear in some of their books.
And then did you also work for the European publisher Egmont too?
Yeah, I was working for them primarily.
Okay.
After I worked there, I started getting working for
Okay.
Egmont or Gutenberg House, as it
Yeah.
was originally known.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I was working for them for close to 20 years, just about 20 years.
Hmm.
My wife started doing a lot of writing for them also. She worked for about 28 years.
Hmm.
They fired me long before there was a point where their sales were decreasing.
Yeah.
And they got rid of a lot of their freelancers, the creators and whatnot, just to keeping it down to a minimum. And
Yeah.
I didn't make the cut, unfortunately. But as it happened, it was about the time I was thinking, I've been doing this maybe a little too long. I want to get back to Mr. Monster, and I want to get back to some of these other things.
Hmm.
And so it was actually a good time, even though I was a little nerve wracking, suddenly losing your main source of income for many years.
Right. You mentioned
Yeah,
Seedman. He actually was on this podcast. I had forgotten
who
until you
was?
mentioned Seedman was on this
Oh,
podcast quite a couple years ago. So,
mm-hmm.
and we talked about, how he was involved with all these Disney comics. Another person who was involved with him at the time. Did you work with David Gerstein at all? Or,
Yeah, mm-hmm.
okay. So, yeah, he hasn't been on here, but he's a friend of mine too. So I was
Right.
just kind of curious, how everything kind of connects together,
Well, I was there when he first was hired, and he was this, scared little kid who was,
right?
just in the big city for the first time, and
Hmm.
couldn't quite know how to use a taxi cab and this and that here. But he's done okay for himself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I knew him back when we had was known. Here's an archaic term, an APA, Amateur
Hmm.
Press Association,
Association, yeah.
and it was called WTFB, which stood for Where the Fun Begins. And it was focused on the Disney afternoon cartoons, but you could really talk about almost anything Disney, which I did. I used to write columns for it, and I'd talk about the cartoons somewhat, but I'd also talk about the parks and everything, the movies and stuff like that. So,
Hmm.
yeah, that's where I first met Gerstein. So it's like it was a while
Oh,
ago.
okay.
So,
Mm.
um, no, it says when I read that you also work for Bart Simpson or the Simpsons comics. Was that directly for Bongo with Bill Morrison or?
Yeah, there was
Yeah.
Bongo, Bill Morrison. I
Okay.
did a few stories for
I'm sure I
them.
read those just like I read the Disney ones, but
Hmm.
again, not thinking it's the same person, so
Right.
you
No,
know,
that was fun. And then later on, I got contacted um, about doing some stuff for uh, SpongeBob
oh
SquarePants,
yeah, yeah.
and that was really a lot of fun. I got a
Hmm.
chance to do some characters, and I had to do my homework because I hadn't seen much of
Oh yeah.
SpongeBob, so I got to see some of the cartoons and
Now, typically on the stuff, were you writing or drawing or both, or what
both
was?
usually.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So
Hmm.
I'll have to go back and look. I mean, it's all in the
Yeah.
boxes in the other room. I
Well,
just don't
yeah.
remember.
Right. Well,
It's
and
yeah.
before then, I had also been able to do a few things for mainstream. I did a Superman graphic novel that I
Hmm.
wrote and illustrated and colored,
Hmm.
and a Batman Legends of the Dark Knight issue. Again,
Okay,
I got a chance to write and draw and
okay.
color the issue. So that was a thrill because I grew up with Superman and Batman,
What was the
and
Superman one? What was it? Just called Superman, or have?
it was called Man and Superman, and
Oh,
it's
I remember that. Okay, all
yeah,
right. That's what.
MANN, and it
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
guy. It had a kind of a cute little premise. It was this guy Marty Mann,
Hmm.
who was this small time crook with this little 10-year-old kid that he was raising, and he's just a bitter, and he's just jealous of Superman. This guy's got everything. He was born on Krypton, and the girls all go crazy about him. Well, he gets this magic little stone at some point that
Hmm.
switches his brains with Superman, and suddenly he's Superman, and Superman is this, in this tenement with this kid, and no money, and just hated. The premise was to see how would they eventually wind up.
Hmm.
Does it take more than just being born on a planet to make you a hero?
Hmm.
But I'm very proud of that one.
So now you're finally working for the big two. I mean, I think you did a Doctor Strange
It was, yeah, that was just about the only Marvel thing I did
okay,
of the,
okay.
the short
But
thing.
you
So
did. So I mean, how did those come about? Was it just luck, or did they finally see your stuff from elsewhere and say, "Oh,
I
we like this
think,
guy. Let's bring him in. He's
well,
done
I
Mr.
think that's when
Monster."
I talked to Tom Brevoort at Marvel. He's a really really good guy, a fan of old comics and whatnot. So I
Mhm.
pitched him um, an idea. It was a little difficult because they were having this anthology title called Marvel Double Shot. They would have two stories from the different Marvel characters. And I would say, how about I do a short Spider-Man story? No, Joe Schmo's doing Spider-Man. How about this? No, he's doing who's left. So, so I finally got the
Go
idea of
down the
doing.
ladder. Oh, Doctor Strange. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I'm a huge Steve Ditko fan, and of
Yeah.
course the
Yeah.
Steve Ditko Doctor Strange, and written by Stan Lee. So I came up with a Doctor Strange story that was sort of an amalgam of Stan Lee and
Hmm.
Steve Ditko back and then, but through my own vision, and I
Hmm.
had a lot of fun with that one too.
Hmm. Now, in the DC ones you just mentioned, how did you get into there? Who did you contact there that you?
That one was one of the. It's funny because usually, it's been my experience if I go to comic conventions and I'm desperate and I'm looking for work, and this never works.
Right.
Um,
But it
never
worked,
works.
huh? No, I don't know.
Never works.
Uh,
So I was
uh,
down there, and my wife was down there, and she was walking around talking, and she's talked to I think Joey Cavalieri,
hmm,
one of the editors at DC, and he knew my work, like my work, and he said, give him, let him try. Send me a pitch and let's see what we got here. And I went through about 5 or 6 different things before we finally got one that he liked. And so that's where that came from.
very cool.
And that led to the Batman and this and that. So I
Well,
I haven't done a ton of it, but I've done stuff that I've been very happy with. And
right,
you
but
know, we-
I'm just kind of curious about it because that was your initial intention, but it took a long time to get there.
mhm.
But hey, better late than never. If that's one of your
Well, yeah, I mean,
bucket
really, I
list type
mean,
items. Work for Marvel, work for DC, work for you know,
mhm.
you know.
Well, it's funny. I've had this discussion with my late friend Batten Lash. He does
Oh yeah, yeah.
Wolf and Bird Supernatural Law,
Hmm. Hmm.
and we were talking. And he had the same thing where he was trying to get to DC and Marvel, and he wouldn't give him the time of day, this and that here.
Right.
And we both agree. We're lucky we didn't get that. We created our own characters that we own.
Yeah.
Again, this was the lesson that Will Eisner taught us. He
Hmm.
has the spirit. He owns the spirit. He
Right.
he probably has the spirit has probably appeared as many companies as Mr. Monster has, but
Right.
he owned them, so he can move them as he wanted to. Whereas if you fall in love with you work on the X-Men, well, they can kick you out of there anytime they want. You don't have any say whatsoever.
True. And then you don't always think even Doctor Strange, even though you say Ditko, it wasn't always Ditko. It could be anybody doing it. And so, like for Mr. Monster, always think of you. For uh Supernatural Law, always think of Bat and Lash. So
Hmm.
it really is your baby. Unless you decide to delegate it to somebody else, it's like so and
Yeah.
so is going to now do it.
Well,
But
that was a nice thing
yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
working for the independents.
Mhm.
That came in the wake of underground comics, and then came the ground level comics like Star Reach and Imagine and Quack, and then the independents. Like First Comics were doing a lot of really nice stuff, like Steve Root and Mike Barron's Nexus series, just
Mhm.
amazing stuff. And
Mhm.
Greg also got to do his various opera adaptations and Jungle Book adaptations, and beautiful beautiful work.
Mhm. Now you're also kind of a historian. I'm
Hmm.
seeing now. Was that always the case, or just kind of evolved over time because you just kind of acquired a knowledge of being in the industry and collecting old issues and things like that?
Well, I've always been fascinated with comic book history.
Hmm.
I can remember when I was like 8 or 9 years old. I got an issue of Sad Sack. And I was just curious, how old is this? And I saw the indicia,
All right.
and it said, 1957 or whatever. But then it said at the bottom, patented in 1930. And I was thinking, well, is it 1930 or is it 1957? So even then I was asking, about history.
Right.
And I kept reading everything I could with fanzines and
Hmm.
comic book things here. And one of the things I was doing with when I was doing my Mr. Monster series is I had a spin-off called the Mr. Monster Super Duper Specials,
Yeah.
where I would reprint the best Golden Age comics, Jack Cole's True Crime comics, Jerry Grandinetti's Dr. Drew, and I would write the background notes for that stuff. So that's really where I started. This was about 1986, 87.
Yeah.
Um, Bob Howell's Victoria. So that was when I was going on, but I got hooked. I've been doing Alter Ego magazine. I have a column in there,
Right.
Mr. Monster's Comic Crypt, which I've been doing, good Lord, about 25 years,
Yeah.
pretty close to that. And with everything else I've done here is mostly an accident. um, One of the things I was doing, I was at the University of, uh, let's see, where was I? In California, in Oregon rather. Very very close to where you are,
Yeah.
the University of Oregon. They had Janet found out that they had the Gardner Fox collection in their library. He was the guy that did the Justice Society in the 40s and a lot of famous DC characters back. So I was fascinated by it. Was able to get boxes of the stuff and look through it. Some of they had some really early Action Comics and things like that from Gardner Fox's collection.
Mhm.
Well, one of the things he had was a box filled with letters that fans had sent him.
Hmm.
And one of those fans, who was rather prolific, was a kid named Roy Thomas,
Hmm.
um, who had just started doing some teaching, some college, some teaching English back in 1961,
Mhm.
and he was encouraging them to, bring back some of the characters and blah 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 blah. Well, anyway, I thought this is kind of cool. Why don't I make Xerox of this and send it to Roy? Maybe he'd like to see, his old letters. Well, by coincidence, I didn't know it at the time. Roy had done Alter Ego magazine, the fanzine, starting in 1981, ended in 1961, ended in 1969.
Right.
When he got, he's too busy doing becoming editor in chief at Marvel and the main writer at Marvel to do that kind of stuff, this and that
Mhm.
here. But at this point, he was going to revive it,
Hmm.
and he said, well, "Would you like to do a little column about the things you found here?" So I said, "Oh, okay, I'll do one of those." Well, one led to two, it led to three, and before you know it, I'm up to 168 or something like that
Yeah.
columns that I've done over 25 years.
I figure I've always seen it in there. I mean, uh, I've only had, I think, about 5 articles during that period of time. But
Hmm.
I tend to write for back issue, so that's kind of more my stomping ground, Silver Age and Bronze
Hmm.
Age and stuff, more than Golden Age. So it's like I leave it to experts like you that know the Golden Age. They go, "Ooh, and learn stuff," rather than
Hmm.
try to write an article. But every so often, Roy Thomas throws me a bone and says, "Hey, can you write an article about this?" And so
Hmm.
um, I'm supposed to write one, and it's on at my leisure, which means I'm not doing it. I
Uh,
need to work on it. Is a Harvey superhero article that
hmm.
covers the Golden Age and the Silver Age versions that came out. The later Joe Simon ones and everything like that. So
Yeah.
you know, and obviously I've already covered that in my book, the Harvey Comics Companion. So I
Hmm.
just need to kind of embellish and update and revise and blah blah blah. And if I
Yeah.
got an article, I just have to do it. So
Right. That's a
yeah,
tricky thing.
yeah.
Well, I'm impressed
um,
you got as many books as you got. Yeah, that's
yeah, well, I mean, it's like that's why I don't, do the article. If you don't give me a deadline, it's like it really goes to the bottom of the pile. So, he
hmm.
said try to do it sometime this year. Well, this year just started, so you know,
Okay.
but I'll probably get it done. I just have a few other things to get out of the way. Uh, other things that I know that you've done because I've seen them because of being a Harvey fan and stuff like that is
Hmm.
you've written introductions or even helped compile books for PS Art books and stuff like that. I believe is like Planet Comics and Airboy and things like that. Is that correct?
I don't think I did Airboy, but I did a couple of Planet
Okay,
Comics
Planet Comics then. Okay.
collections.
Okay.
And I think I wrote one for Chamber of Chills or something like
Yeah, I
that.
know you did a Chamber of Chills because that's, where I
Hmm.
saw, and I probably quoted you in my Harvey book too.
Oh, okay.
In the horror chapter, somewhere in there, you probably see your name, and I didn't even know I used it.
Mhm.
But how did those come about? Was it just you finding out that PS Art Books was looking for writers for their intros and things like that, or
I think I was trying to get a way to get some of the books that I could afford. So I think
yeah,
I suggested, yeah, maybe I could write some introductions for them.
okay,
And I gotten some, I already done some introductions for the DC archives,
oh
which
yeah,
was, the big ones. I had done an introduction for one of the books of Plastic Man collection. I did one for the Spirit, which was kind of exciting,
hmm
to get my foot in there also, and about two, three others, I think, something.
hmm
Um, and at that point, I was already in alter ego, so that gave me a certain gravitas as far as what I can do, and I've had a lot of practice writing that kind of stuff, so I can write
right.
some entertaining pieces.
Of course, Roy has also done some of the. I think he did the Heap or something like they're the
Oh,
thing.
he's
One
done a
of
lot of stuff. Yeah,
for PS Art Books too. So I mean, I know you're all kind of working in conjunction with them at the
sure.
so let's see, so that leads us to like when you reached out to me and you wanted to do a trade, you know
Hmm.
I mean, forgive me, but I like the history stuff. I mean, it's like I like Elric, I like Mr. Monster even more, but it's like when I said, can I have this instead, and you agreed to it, I was like, all right, because this is a heavy book. Ugh, tops.
Hmm.
How did this come about? I had no idea that this was this big. When I was suggesting it, I just figured it was regular comic book size. And
Oh
I went,
no,
oh
no.
yeah, but I knew it was a history book, even though it had reprints of the books in it. It had a big history about it, and that's what was intriguing to me. So how did that come about? Did you have these comics? I know there's only like two issues.
Yeah,
How did
yeah.
you find out about it? I don't even know.
Okay. Well, I found out about it. There was a historian still is around, Bill Spicer, who did
Oh yeah.
Graphic Story magazine back in the late '60s.
Mhm,
Very well done comic history book, and he had an article about Tops,
mhm,
which was Charles Byro's pet project. Charles Byro was the guy back in the '40s and '50s who did Crime Does Not Pay comics, the original Daredevil, Boy Comics, this and that. You're very, very good writer, very exciting writer and artist. He would
mhm,
write and draw these things here. Um, but he had a dream of doing comics for adults,
mm,
going past the just the kiddie stuff. The stuff he was doing, like Crime Does Not Pay, was already for an older audience. I mean, it was really, blood and guts and gore and such.
right.
But he wanted to go one step beyond that and do something. This is around 1949, and he had a progressive publisher, Lev Gleason, and Lev finally said, "Okay, give it a try."
Mhm,
And so they did it Life magazine size, really
yeah.
big. They would have stories for lovelorn stories for the girls. They would have political stories for the guys, crime stories. They had a couple of crime stories that were illustrated by Reed Crandall, who 4 or 5 years later would do some brilliant work doing crime stories for EC. But this
Mhm,
is before that,
right.
um, and and I had been just fascinated by this thing. I kept looking for copies of Tops for 50 friggin' years.
Oh,
I mean, I found some, but they were so expensive I couldn't touch them.
mhm.
And then in the middle of the pandemic, I said, I have a lot of some free time here. Let's see if I can do something with it. And if I can convince Fantagraphics
Mhm,
to publish a book like this, I might be able to convince a couple of collectors, like Roger Hill and George Hagenauer, to see if they can lend me their issues so I can scan them and clean them and write,
Hmm.
information about them, and finally read the things.
Right.
And wonder of wonder, they were generous enough to do it, even though it was going to hurt their copies, but they wanted this stuff preserved.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what I did. I scanned them all, spent months cleaning them up, making the blacks really black. Uh, Anything that was misregistered color wise, I put it in there, and
Hmm.
wrote about 40, 50 pages of background information and biographical information. There were like 50 different cartoonists and artists. There were writers and artists in the book. And I wanted to make sure that you were all talked about,
Hmm.
who they were.
I
So
guess
this is the most deluxe book I've ever worked on. So I was really thrilled how it turned out. Fantagraphics did just terrific job.
I guess Lev Gleason was about 25 years too soon, because I mean it's similar to like the limited collector's edition or the Marvel Treasury editions or anything that came out
Yeah,
in the 70s, because those were all oversized, and they had original art in some of them, original
right.
stories and stuff like
Well,
that. So
that was the thing. I mean, it was just it was an oversized thing, so the newsstand didn't really know how to handle it, and only lasted 2 issues. We
yeah.
collected both issues in this in full
Hmm.
color and this, but it
And
was just a
did you ask Roger how he got his copy, since he said you've been searching for 50 years for
well,
one?
I've seen copies for
Oh,
sale.
okay.
I just
Not
couldn't
cheap.
afford them.
Oh, okay, got it.
He can.
Okay. I don't know if I've ever even seen copies, because um it's kind of funny, unless a comic is comic book size, even if it's golden age to present, you usually don't see it. Like I've seen like that big Whammo comic that's like so big
Right.
once in San Diego. It was probably about a dozen years ago, and it's like,
Hmm.
of course they had all wrapped up, so I couldn't open it up. But I go, yeah, that's a big comic. I don't know what to do with
Hmm.
it. So, you know, anyway, but yeah, so you have seen them, but yeah, just not at an affordable price. I get it. So,
Right.
yeah. Huh.
So I was, I didn't need to own the thing here. I just wanted to be able to read it and study
Yeah,
it. And I finally got a chance to, and it was very exciting sitting, getting a chance
yeah.
to read these things. And I
And
know
I
there were a lot of,
appreciate it, because it's like, and I'll thank Gary Groth. I'm sure he's the one you worked with, since this fan of graphics.
and his son Conrad Groth too.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
did a great job editing.
Because I mean, sometimes they might just say, nobody's interested in this stuff. We'll take a pass. And you're like, you know,
So,
because,
yeah, no,
there's
he
people.
went right for it.
Okay,
And
because there's people out there like me. It's like I might be the Harvey guy, but when it's ever history type stuff like this that I don't know about, I'm like, I eat it up. So it's like I love it.
mhm.
So um,
Well, I mean, one of the things when I asked Roger Hill to lend me his copy, he said he would if they agreed to do it actual full size and hardcover.
yeah,
And that was what I was hoping too. And luckily they said, sure, let's do that.
yeah.
Uh,
And I am glad too, because it surprised me when I got the thing in the mail. I go, "Oh crap, that's a big book!" I didn't even look. I just thought, I didn't even actually know that it was oversized. I just knew
mhm,
it was a rare series, and I knew about Reed Crandall being in it, and a few others, and I just wanted to read the history about it, and of course, read the books themselves.
mhm,
And, I don't know if you got it. I'm sure you do if you're similar. About a year or two back, where they did another limited collector's edition, first edition, and it was all new comics #1, or more fun
mhm.
#1. That's what it
Oh,
was.
you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm,
I'm getting my titles mixed up. More fun #1. And I just thought that was wonderful, because it's like, why stop where you stop? Do some more of these. I
mhm,
love these old reprintings of things, because it's like, you can never see them anymore. They're either sealed in plastic, or they're cost prohibitive, or I you
mhm,
know if I'd be afraid to damage something if I was looking at original of this, even if somebody said, like Roger said, sure, go take a look at it, I'd be like, nervous.
mhm.
Now I can kind of just pilfer through it, just look at it at my leisure and have fun, you know.
Well, I mean, that goes back to, we're talking about the difference in technology from back then. I was talking about my artwork and all this other stuff here.
Yeah.
But back then, you know, if you had the comics, maybe you have a coverless comic. Nowadays, I've got this huge digital collection of these incredibly rare comics that I could never afford, and it's in a thing this big. And I have 30,000 copies in that. and I can access it anytime I want. It's just fantastic. And if I want to put a stack of old comics next to it, I can even have this comic book smell. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah,
but
that's one thing I'm happy about digital. I mean, there is like websites to do public domain uh scans and things like that. And it's like, you know, that actually helped me a lot when I was doing my Harvey book, because
sure.
my problem with doing Harvey history, initially I never really covered the early golden age stuff because I never saw it, and it's like,
Hmm.
slowly over time, I'd see copies of Pocket Comics and old Green Hornets or something like that, but
Hmm.
never enough to like really peruse them and go through it where I can get a sense of what the actual history was year after year after year. So finally I was able to in the last decade. So,
Hmm.
that's how my book came out. So
Well, well,
anyway.
yeah. Well, it's also interesting seeing that the difference in the reprint material that we've seen here. I mean, I remember 30 years ago when DC would come out with the DC Archives, and the first issues of Action Comics and
Mhm.
Batman and all this other stuff, and it's like, oh, exciting, this and that here. Well, things have improved so much that it
Yeah.
looks crude to me now, because they took these things and they would re-ink some of them, and
Yeah.
the digital comics that are scanned, I find much better, and a lot of the reprints that are being done by guys like Fantagraphics and whatnot, scan the original comics, clean them up, and which is what I did with Tops, and it looks so much better. I mean, it just,
Yeah.
but you couldn't have pictured that 30 years ago. They didn't have scanners that
Yeah.
would do this kind of stuff.
Right. I go back even further on that is in the 70s, they had the origins of Marvel Comics and Son of Origins and Bring on the Bad
Mhm.
Guys. And you look at them now and you go, these look horrible. It's like
uh
at the time they were state of the art and it's like, it's on nice paper and it's pristine and blah, blah, blah. But,
hmm
they've since with, future archival restorations, made even better copies of those
hmm
comics. So, it's like,
Yeah.
but anyway. I wish they would do it, on other genres and stuff like that. I mean, that's the part, because me. Well, you don't know me that well, but it's like I'm the
Mhm.
funny animal guy. I like all the
Right.
non superhero stuff, and so
Mhm.
it doesn't mean I hate the superhero stuff. It just means like I'm always intrigued about that other stuff, and I always think like DC and Marvel, they're sitting on a gold mine. I mean, DC could do a complete run of Peter Pork Chops and or something like that, but they
Mhm.
don't do it because they think it won't sell.
Well, or Sugar
And
and Spike even more
yeah,
than that.
the
Jeez.
Sugar and Spike, they did the one volume, and it's like, how about some more? It's like there's not 98 issues. You only did 4 issues. How about some
Well,
more?
99 issues, but they
Yeah, they
never
did a
went to that.
99th one.
They
That's
never
right.
did that 100th issue.
Right, right.
It's kind of crazy to me. Why did you quit at that point?
Well, that's another chance to do it. I'm sure that there's a few more scattered stories out there that didn't make it in the U.S. because didn't they appear in the little digest or something that
Yeah,
that were
they were some
yeah.
overseas that had never seen print here.
Yeah.
So
So that
yeah,
could be
like
the
this.
100th issue. Huh. Anyway, but all that stuff, and Marvel too, they published Millie the Model for what, 25, 30 years. And,
Oh, at
there's
least,
there's
yeah.
never been a Millie the Model collection at
Hmm.
all,
Well, I mean, I was
So,
thankful that they were
yeah.
doing things like
uh,
uh, the horror stuff, Strange Tales
yeah.
and whatnot.
Yeah.
I love seeing the Steve Ditko, um, what are those called? Um, those giant books that they did with his backup strips, those little
Yeah.
science fiction backup strips, mystery strips. They did one with Jack Kirby's monster books and this and that here,
Yeah. So
and
that's a
just love
start,
seeing those.
you know.
And
That's
they,
one.
they had a few with the Jungle Books and
Mhm.
the '50s stuff, but not nearly enough. And again, they should be scanning it. I mean, unless you have the actual negatives that
Yeah.
these were printed from, scan it from the comics.
Right. Exactly. But I can keep wishing someday
Mhm.
all this stuff will come out, hopefully. But anyway, um, so at this point, what projects are you working on now? What's coming up for you? And
Mhm. Well, as I
Any
say, my main thing at the moment is going back and doing the Mr. Monster library.
Okay.
You know, I don't like deadlines, so I'm gonna put them together and get all the work done, and then try and sell it to a publisher.
Okay.
One of the nice things of being at an age where I'm getting Social Security is I do have money coming in, and I can indulge myself with this, and I like
Mhm.
that.
Very good.
So I've been, burrowing through, boxes that go down back decades, and trying to get the best copies of the artwork and the colors,
Hmm.
and go from there. So that's keeping me, and it's something I really enjoy. And of course, I keep doing the Mr. Monsters Comic Crypt and Alter Ego magazine, and we've been an odd, I do commissions, and whatever odd jobs might come in here. I
Hmm.
just never know what's coming up next.
Hmm. Any personal appearances or anything now that COVID is kind of going on the down low, or
Yeah,
um,
I think I'm just going to be coming to Philadelphia. I forget which convention, but one of those in a few months.
okay.
Uh, I have a Facebook page if people want to take a look, and I'll be announcing whatever projects or places I'm going at that point.
Okay. And apart from the Facebook page, how do people get in contact with you if they want to do a commission or just contact you and ask you a question?
They can email me at mgilberts 00 at comcast.net, and I
Hmm.
will answer them.
Okay.
Um, we have that. On a different subject, I think it's kind of funny that we're talking like this because uh, I was living in Eugene, Oregon for 25 years, moved back to Ohio about 4 years ago, so Janet could be closer to her family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And you're in Springfield, and
Well,
I don't
I
know,
also
which is
lived in
right next
Eugene
to it.
briefly. Yeah. So,
Did we meet?
I was in Eugene. I moved here in 2015. So,
Okay.
um, were you here then, or were you already gone? Um,
4 years ago, so do the math.
okay, so yeah, you were here.
Yeah.
Did you go to the EC show that was at the
Yeah, I
Schnitzer?
did.
Okay, I helped put that together a little bit with Ben,
Okay.
because that was when I first moved here, and I said, I don't know what I can contribute, but I helped with the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco. I'm from California,
Hmm.
and I have every issue of Mad and stuff like that. I don't have much original art, but my first four issues of Mad got into the show, and some
Hmm.
paperback collections, and my copy of Seduction of the Innocent was on display.
Yeah,
So
cool.
I got a little bit, no original art, but I just kind of helped round out,
Hmm.
the items on display. So
Yeah, it's
um,
a pretty impressive little show, wasn't it?
mhm.
Hmm.
Kind of wish they do another one, but it's like, oh well, one's better than. And I gave a talk at the end of it on Harvey Kurtzman, so that was,
Oh, okay.
and that's on YouTube somewhere if you ever want to look it up.
Oh.
So, that was fun,
Mhm.
and so I don't know if I saw you there or not. I went to the show about 3 or 4 times at least during that whole period of time
Yeah,
where I was
likewise.
gone.
So
Yeah,
you probably bumped into me without really push
yeah,
me aside, and
yeah.
we'll
That
get a
was
closer look at that Wallywood page over here.
exactly.
That
Now, the,
phrase out of page.
yeah, the page everybody wanted was that Weird Science Fantasy cover, the
Hmm.
Rosetta cover. That was like, oh, I want, it's like,
Yeah. The
anyway,
holiest of holy grails. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I'm more on the silly end, so I'm like pawing the Basil Wolverton Mad 11 cover.
Hmm.
So anyway, go figure. Anyway, but um well, it was a pleasure talking to you. It's kind of funny you lived here and now you're gone. So you're in Ohio now? Is that where you are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We moved back. We're living in Stowe. I just bought a house about 4 months ago. After 4 years of looking,
Hmm.
we finally found one, and it's adjacent to Kent, which is where I was working with Craig
Yeah.
Russell on Elric. So I
Yeah.
come full circle here.
Yeah, interesting. You moved back to Ohio when initially you said maybe slightly hesitant to move there in the first place because you had never been there, But then,
Hmm.
you were starting your life over, so
Right.
starting it over again. Life's
Well,
life's a series of that. You start over, so you know.
well, A couple years after moving here, I met my wife, Janet.
Yeah, that's cool.
It turned out well. My career worked, then my love life worked out. So,
Yeah. For me, I came up with a different girlfriend, and then we
mhm,
broke up. And I'm with my current wife now. She and I were working together, but we were just friends. But then once
mhm,
that situation ended, we got closer, and then after I got kicked out, I moved from Eugene to Springfield because it was right next door, and
mhm.
I'm still here.
Okay.
So I moved from Animal House to Simpsons. So anyway, all right. Well, Michael, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you again for the Tops book, and I will recommend that anybody who is interested in comic history and old comics buy this book from Fantagraphics.
And I will recommend it too.
Yay! And it's a heavy book, but we
Oh
get the
man.
work out here. And you know, pleasure maybe have you on again, talk about Golden Age history or something in the future.
Okay.
And I thank you again. And that pretty much wraps it up for another episode of the Fun Ideas Podcast.
Thank you,
And
sir.
we'll see you next time.
Good.